In the gleaming towers of La Défense, Paris's financial district, the morning of November 15, 2023, began like any other. Bankers sipped their café au lait, traders monitored their screens, and in the sterile halls of the French Ministry of Finance, bureaucrats prepared what they believed would be a surgical strike against a rebellious African nation. They had no idea they were about to trigger the most profound transformation in post-colonial Africa since independence. France's relationship with its former colonies had always been a delicate dance of control disguised as cooperation. The CFA franc binding 14 African nations to French monetary policy. Military bases scattered across the Sahel, justified as peacekeeping missions. Mining concessions that seemed generous on paper but delivered African wealth to European shareholders. For decades, this system had worked flawlessly, until a young military officer in Burkina Faso decided to ask a simple question that would shatter everything. This is not merely a story of politics or economics. It is the definitive account of how one man's refusal to submit transformed financial warfare into a continental awakening. When France froze over $327 million in Burkina Faso's assets, they expected capitulation. Instead, they got revolution, not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa and beyond. At precisely 9:17 a.m. on November 15, 2023, a confidential memorandum left the French Ministry of Finance. 3 lines of text that would reshape the geopolitical landscape of West Africa. Pursuant to Article 47 of the Franco-African Monetary Cooperation Framework, all financial assets linked to the Central Reserve of Burkina Faso are to be frozen pending further diplomatic consultation, effective immediately. Authorization level, maximum. The language was clinical, diplomatic, devastating. Behind those sterile words lay the full weight of neo-colonial power exercised through digital channels. With the stroke of a keyboard, France had weaponized the global financial system against a nation of 22 million people. The decision had been months in the making. In the mahogany-paneled conference rooms of the Élysée Palace, ministers had grown increasingly frustrated with Captain Ibrahim Traoré's administration. Unlike previous Burkinabe leaders who had played by the established rules, Traoré had begun asking uncomfortable questions. Why were French mining companies extracting gold at prices set in Paris rather than Ouagadougou? Why did Burkina Faso import refined petroleum products at premium prices when it could process its own crude? Why did the nation's youth migrate to France for opportunities that could exist at home? These questions threatened a system that had functioned profitably for 60 decades. Traditional diplomatic pressure had failed. Traoré's popularity among his people remained high. Military intervention would be costly and internationally controversial. Financial warfare offered what appeared to be a perfect solution: invisible, deniable, and historically effective. Within 30 minutes of the freeze order, the effects began cascading through Burkina Faso's financial ecosystem like a virus through a network. Government accounts that had contained millions at breakfast were empty by lunch. Scheduled payments to teachers, healthcare workers, and civil servants evaporated. Import letters of credit for fuel, medicine, and agricultural supplies were suspended. International wire transfers ground to a halt. The timing was calculated for maximum impact. November marked the beginning of the dry season, when fuel imports peaked for agricultural machinery. It was also budget preparation season, when the government typically secured funding for the coming fiscal year. France had studied Burkina Faso's financial rhythms and struck at the moment of greatest vulnerability. In Ouagadougou's bustling markets, the effects were immediate but subtle. Fuel stations began rationing diesel. Hospital administrators quietly canceled orders for imported medical supplies. University administrators postponed infrastructure projects. The strangling was gradual, designed to build pressure without triggering immediate crisis, a financial python rather than a viper. French analysts had modeled several scenarios for Burkina Faso's response. In the most likely scenario, Traoré would request emergency consultations within 72 hours. The French ambassador would offer a face-saving compromise, partial unfreezing of assets in exchange for reforms that would essentially restore French oversight of key economic sectors. Pride would be salvaged, control would be maintained, and the neo-colonial system would continue functioning. Alternative scenarios included domestic political upheaval, as unpaid soldiers and civil servants turned against their government, or international mediation through the African Union or ECOWAS that would ultimately favor French interests. What French strategists had not anticipated was silence. For 48 hours after the freeze, there was no formal communication from Burkina Faso's government. No emergency diplomatic meetings, no public protests, no appeals to international organizations. The expected panic never materialized, replaced by something far more unsettling: strategic quiet. Inside the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The building itself reflected the austere character of its occupant. No gilded halls or marble columns, just functional spaces designed for work rather than ceremony. In a modest conference room lit by harsh fluorescent lights, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat with his closest advisors around a simple wooden table scarred by countless meetings. The team assembled represented a new generation of African leadership. Dr. Aminata Sow, the Minister of Economy, had earned her Ph.D. in developmental economics from the University of Dakar and had spent 5 years analyzing resource extraction patterns across Francophone Africa. Colonel Isaka Okaraga, the National Security Advisor, combined military training with advanced degrees in cybersecurity and digital governance. Jean-Baptiste Kabore, the 32-year-old software architect who had returned from Silicon Valley specifically to serve his country. The room's whiteboard was covered in numbers. $327 million frozen. 8.2 million citizens dependent on government salaries and services. 45 days of fuel reserves. 30 days of medical supplies. The mathematics of strangulation were precise and unforgiving. Dr. Sow broke the silence with her assessment. Mr. President, we cannot sustain government operations beyond 6 weeks. The freeze affects not just central reserves, but all correspondent banking relationships. We're effectively cut off from the international financial system. Her voice was steady, professional, but the implications were clear. Colonel Ouedraogo added the security perspective. Public awareness of the freeze is still limited, but that won't last. When salary payments fail next week, we'll face potential unrest. Military loyalty is strong, but soldiers' families need to eat. Kabore, the youngest member of the team, leaned forward. The technical aspects are what concern me most. This isn't just about frozen accounts. They've effectively blocked our access to SWIFT messaging, correspondent banking networks, and even routine foreign exchange transactions. It's a comprehensive digital blockade. For several minutes, silence filled the room as each advisor contemplated scenarios ranging from desperate to catastrophic. Then Captain Traoré stood and walked to the window overlooking Ouagadougou's sprawling neighborhoods. His next words would later be remembered as the moment everything changed. Who owns our gold mines? The question seemed to come from nowhere. Dr. Sow looked up from her financial projections, confused. Mr. President, I'm not sure how that's relevant to our immediate crisis. But Traoré was already moving, his mind racing through possibilities his advisors couldn't yet see. How much gold do we produce annually? How much is currently stockpiled? And most importantly, how much of that production is tied to French companies? Traoré quickly accessed government databases on his laptop. Annual production is approximately 60 tons, worth roughly $3.8 billion at current prices. About 70% is extracted through joint ventures with French and Canadian companies. We have approximately 2.1 tons in strategic reserves, mostly stored in various facilities across the country. And if we were to nationalize those operations? Traoré's voice was calm, but the implications electrified the room. Dr. So's eyes widened as she began to understand. That would give us direct control over production and pricing. Instead of receiving royalty payments through the international banking system, we could trade gold directly for essential imports. Barter economics, Colonel Ouedraogo added, warming to the concept. Gold for fuel with Nigeria. Gold for medicine with India. Gold for food with neighboring countries. It bypasses the entire financial system they're using against us. But it was Traoré who grasped the revolutionary potential. We could build our own system, not just barter, a complete alternative financial infrastructure based on verified physical assets rather than foreign currencies. What followed was the most intense planning session in modern African governance. Working through the night, the team sketched out a radical reimagining of economic sovereignty. Traditional models of development cooperation would be replaced by resource-based partnerships. International banking would be bypassed through direct asset exchanges. Most revolutionary of all, citizens would have real-time access to information about their nation's actual wealth. Traoré understood that this wasn't just about surviving France's financial attack. It was about building something fundamentally different. If we're going to do this, he told his team as dawn broke over Ouagadougou, we're going to do it transparently. Every gram of gold, every trade, every transaction will be visible to our people. No more backroom deals, no more opacity, no more excuses. The plan that emerged over those crucial hours would soon be known as the Sovereignty Protocol. It combined immediate tactical responses with long-term strategic transformation. Phase 1 involved securing physical control of mining operations and establishing direct trade relationships. Phase 2 would create a blockchain-based transparency system. Phase 3 would expand the model regionally, creating an alliance of resource-rich nations committed to transparent, sovereign economic management. At 11:30 a.m. on November 17, 2023, Burkina Faso's state television interrupted regular programming for what viewers expected to be a routine presidential address. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented in the history of African leadership. Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared on screen wearing not the formal attire of a head of state, but the functional clothing of a working miner. Hard hat, reflective vest, steel-toed boots. The symbolism was immediate and powerful. While other leaders spoke from palace offices about abstract policies, Traoré was speaking from the source of his nation's actual wealth. The location was the Escane gold mine, Burkina Faso's largest gold production facility, previously operated under a joint venture between the government and international partners. The choice was deliberate. This mine alone produced nearly 400,000 ounces of gold annually, representing over $800 million at current market prices. My fellow citizens of Burkina Faso, Traoré began, his voice carrying clearly over the background noise of extraction equipment. 48 hours ago, France froze $327 million of our national reserves, attempting to force our submission through financial strangulation. Today, I stand in the heart of our true wealth to announce our response. What followed was not a speech, but a series of executive declarations that would reshape West Africa's economic landscape. Immediate nationalization. Effective immediately, all gold mining operations within our borders are under direct state control. Foreign companies will be compensated fairly, but the days of extracting our wealth under terms dictated elsewhere are over. Direct Trade Initiative. We will no longer sell our gold to foreign intermediaries who determine prices in distant markets. Beginning today, we will trade directly with nations that need our resources, accepting payment in fuel, medicine, food, and technology our people need. The People's Ledger. Most importantly, we are launching the People's Ledger, a system that will allow every citizen to track in real time how much gold is extracted from our land, where it goes, and how the revenue serves our communities. No more secrets, no more backroom deals, no more stolen wealth. Regional Alliance. I call upon our brothers and sisters in Mali, Niger, and across the Sahel to join us in building a new economic order based on our resources, our terms, and our people's prosperity. The broadcast was unlike anything the world had seen from an African leader. There were no appeals to international law, no requests for mediation, no diplomatic language designed to avoid offense. Instead, there was clarity, resolve, and, most unsettling to established powers, competence. International media struggled to categorize what they were witnessing. CNN's initial coverage focused on the theatrical aspects. African leader makes unusual underground address. But as the implications became clear, the tone shifted dramatically. By evening, the Financial Times was running analysis pieces titled "The End of Resource Colonialism" and "How One Nation Could Reshape Global Mining." In Paris, the reaction was immediate panic. The Élysée Palace convened emergency meetings as officials realized they had catastrophically miscalculated. Instead of the expected capitulation, they were facing a coordinated challenge to the entire system of French economic influence in Africa. Worse, Traoré's message was resonating beyond Burkina Faso. Within hours, social media across Francophone Africa was filled with videos of young people recreating his underground address from construction sites, quarries, and even sand pits. Behind the dramatic symbolism lay sophisticated technical planning. The People's Ledger wasn't just a political slogan. Kabore and his team had been developing the blockchain infrastructure for months, initially as a transparency initiative for government contracts. The French financial freeze had accelerated deployment of what would become the world's most advanced resource tracking system. The technology combined satellite monitoring of mining sites, blockchain verification of extraction volumes, smart contracts for trade agreements, and mobile-accessible dashboards for citizen oversight. Every ounce of gold extracted would be logged, every trade recorded, and every revenue stream tracked from mine to market to public benefit. But the true innovation was the dividend algorithm. Rather than traditional taxation and redistribution systems prone to corruption and inefficiency, the People's Ledger would automatically calculate and distribute quarterly payments to every citizen based on actual resource revenues. It was direct democracy applied to national wealth, eliminating bureaucratic intermediaries and political manipulation. Within 72 hours of Traoré's mineshaft manifesto, the ripple effects were visible across Africa. In Nigeria, student groups organized protests demanding similar transparency in oil revenues. Ghanaian civil society organizations petitioned their government to implement blockchain tracking for cocoa exports. Even in South Africa, mining communities began organizing around demands for local revenue sharing from platinum and diamond operations. The African Union, typically cautious about endorsing any member nation's unilateral actions, found itself in an unprecedented position. Public opinion across the continent was overwhelmingly supportive of Traoré's initiatives, but many member governments remained dependent on the same neo-colonial systems he was challenging. 1 week after his underground address, Traoré's presidential jet landed at Bamako's Modibo Keita International Airport in Mali. The visit had been arranged in complete secrecy. Officially, he was conducting routine consultations with regional partners. In reality, he was about to forge the most significant alliance in modern African history. Mali's President Assimi Goïta and Niger's General Abdourahmane Chiani were waiting, along with their senior economic advisors. All three nations shared similar challenges: vast mineral wealth, historical French influence, and populations demanding real sovereignty. But they also shared something more valuable: leaders willing to risk everything for genuine independence. The meeting location was carefully chosen: a modest conference facility overlooking Bamako's Grand Marché, the bustling marketplace that had facilitated trade across West Africa for centuries before European colonization. The symbolism was intentional. They were returning to Africa's indigenous economic traditions while embracing 21st-century technology. Over 3 days of intensive negotiations, the three leaders hammered out what would become known as the SEO Agreement, named in honor of Sékou Touré, Guinea's legendary president who had famously chosen poverty over colonial submission in 1958. But unlike Touré's brave but ultimately tragic experiment, the SEO Pact was built on practical foundations designed for long-term success. Shared gold reserves. Each nation would store 20% of its gold reserves in facilities located in the other two countries, making it impossible for any external power to pressure a single nation through asset seizure. Advanced security systems would protect the deposits, while blockchain ledgers would ensure complete transparency about holdings and movements. Resource-based currency. Trade between the three nations would be conducted using a new unit of account, the Sahel Gold Unit (SGU), backed by verified gold reserves rather than foreign currencies. This would eliminate dependence on both the CFA franc and major international currencies while providing stable value for regional commerce. Technology sharing. The People's Ledger system would be expanded across all three nations with shared technical infrastructure and coordinated development. Citizens of any SEO nation could track resource flows across the entire alliance, creating unprecedented transparency in regional economics. Defense cooperation. Military units would be stationed at strategic mining and processing facilities across all three countries, ensuring that economic sovereignty would be backed by credible security guarantees. Democratic oversight. Perhaps most revolutionary, the SEO Pact mandated citizen participation in major economic decisions. Any trade agreement exceeding $50 million would require public review and citizen input through digital platforms, making backroom deals impossible. The alliance's technical foundation represented a quantum leap in governance innovation. Working with a team of African software engineers, many educated in top universities but committed to serving their home continent, Traoré led the development of integrated systems that would make the SEO model operational. The distributed ledger architecture used multiple interconnected blockchains to ensure no single point of failure. The satellite monitoring network provided real-time verification of mining operations across all three countries. The Citizen Dashboard interface gave every person with a mobile phone access to comprehensive economic data. The smart contract framework automated trade agreements and dividend distributions, eliminating bureaucratic delays and corruption opportunities. But perhaps most importantly, the democratic participation platform created new mechanisms for citizen involvement in governance. Through secure digital voting, community forums, and transparent policy debates, people could engage with economic decisions that directly affected their lives. It was e-democracy applied to resource management, giving ordinary citizens unprecedented power over their nation's development paths. The first major international reaction came not from governments but from financial markets. Within 2 weeks of the SEO Pact announcement, shares in major mining companies with African operations began experiencing significant volatility. Investors, long accustomed to extracting African resources at below-market prices through opaque agreements, suddenly faced the prospect of transparent bidding processes and fair market pricing. The commodity exchanges in London and New York registered their concern through dramatic price movements. Gold futures spiked as traders realized that 3 major producing nations might begin withholding production from global markets. Uranium prices fluctuated wildly as Niger's vast deposits, crucial for French nuclear power generation, came under sovereign control. But the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source: sovereign wealth funds and pension managers seeking stable, inflation-protected investments. The SEO model, with its blockchain verification and transparent governance, offered something rare in global markets: verifiable asset backing and democratic oversight. Within months, these institutional investors were quietly exploring partnerships with the new alliance. The European Union found itself in an unprecedented position. Individual member states had different relationships with the SEO nations. France obviously opposed the new model, but Germany and Italy, major importers of African resources, saw potential benefits in transparent pricing and stable supply agreements. The European Parliament's Development Committee held emergency hearings on the Sahel situation, but the discussions revealed fundamental divisions within Europe. Progressive members praised the transparency and democratic elements of the SEO model, while conservatives worried about threats to European commercial interests. Most telling was the response from European civil society. Environmental groups endorsed the blockchain monitoring of mining operations. Development NGOs praised the direct citizen dividend system. Even labor unions expressed interest in working with African counterparts to ensure fair wages and working conditions in the newly nationalized industries. 6 months after the SEO Pact's implementation, an unusual delegation arrived in Ouagadougou. Representatives from Google, Microsoft, IBM, and several major venture capital firms had requested meetings with the technical teams behind the People's Ledger. They weren't coming as potential investors, they were coming as students. The meetings, conducted in Burkina Faso's modest Ministry of Technology building, were unlike typical Silicon Valley encounters. American executives found themselves learning from African engineers about practical applications of blockchain technology, citizen engagement platforms, and transparent governance systems. Mark Benioff, CEO of Salesforce, later wrote in Harvard Business Review, "I've spent decades in technology, but what I saw in Burkina Faso challenged every assumption I had about innovation, leadership, and the relationship between technology and democracy. They're not just building better systems, they're building a better society." The technical achievements were remarkable by any standard. The People's Ledger processed thousands of transactions daily, with 99.7% uptime despite operating in challenging infrastructure conditions. The citizen engagement platform maintained over 85% participation rates in major policy discussions. The blockchain-based resource tracking system had eliminated virtually all discrepancies between production reports and actual output. Universities across the world began incorporating the SEO model into their curricula. MIT's Sloan School of Management created a dedicated case study examining the alliance's use of blockchain technology for governance. Harvard Kennedy School added courses on resource sovereignty and democratic innovation to its public policy program. The London School of Economics established a research partnership with the University of Ouagadougou to study long-term impacts of transparent resource management. But the most significant academic recognition came from an unexpected source. The Nobel Prize Committee's Economic Sciences panel requested detailed briefings on the SEO model's first-year results. While prize decisions remained confidential, the very fact that Traoré's innovations were being considered at the highest levels of academic recognition sent shockwaves through development economics. The turning point in international opinion came through investigative journalism rather than diplomatic channels. Martine Dubois, a veteran reporter for Le Monde, obtained a cache of internal French government documents that revealed the true scope of France's strategy towards the Sahel region. The leaked documents, classified at the highest levels, showed that the asset freeze against Burkina Faso was part of a coordinated campaign codenamed Opération Retour, Operation Return. The goal was not merely to pressure Burkina Faso, but to engineer economic crises across Mali, Niger, and potentially other Francophone African nations to force renewed acceptance of French oversight. The documents detailed specific tactics, manipulation of commodity prices through French-connected trading companies, covert funding of opposition political groups, and even plans for creating artificial fuel shortages to generate domestic unrest. Most damaging was evidence that French intelligence had been actively working to prevent other European nations from establishing independent relationships with African countries seeking alternatives to French partnerships. The leak's publication triggered immediate international controversy. African Union leaders, even those traditionally aligned with France, expressed outrage at the documented interference in sovereign nations' internal affairs. European Parliament members demanded investigations. Even within France, public opinion began shifting as citizens learned about their government's neo-colonial activities conducted in their name. The most significant reaction came from the United Nations Human Rights Council, which announced formal investigations into whether France's financial warfare tactics constituted violations of international law regarding economic sovereignty and the right to development. French President Emmanuel Macron found himself in an impossible position. Denial was impossible given the authenticated documents, but admission would confirm decades of African accusations about French neocolonialism. The solution was a hasty strategic retreat disguised as diplomatic progress. On a Friday afternoon, with minimal fanfare, French financial authorities quietly lifted the asset freeze on Burkina Faso's accounts. The official statement spoke of constructive dialogue and mutual understanding, but provided no details about what had changed or what agreements had been reached. The truth was simpler. France had been comprehensively outmaneuvered. The SEO alliance was functioning effectively, with gold-based trade flowing smoothly between member nations and their new international partners. The People's Ledger had become a global model for transparent governance. Most importantly, public opinion across Africa had shifted dramatically in favor of the sovereignty model that Traoré represented. French companies found themselves facing a new reality in African markets. Transparent bidding processes replaced backroom negotiations. Fair market pricing replaced artificially suppressed resource costs. Democratic oversight replaced compliant leadership. The old system of control through financial manipulation had become obsolete. 2 years after that fateful Monday morning when France froze his nation's assets, Ibrahim Traoré stood before an international assembly that would have been impossible to imagine at the height of the crisis. Representatives from 47 nations had gathered in Burkina Faso's capital to sign the Ouagadougou Accords on transparent resource governance. The signatories included not just African nations, but countries from across the developing world. Bolivia and Peru with their lithium reserves, Mongolia with its copper and rare earth deposits, Kazakhstan with its oil wealth. Even some developed nations, Norway, Canada, and New Zealand, had committed to implementing elements of the transparency model for their own resource sectors. The Accords established several groundbreaking principles.
Universal resource transparency. All extractive operations above specified thresholds would be subject to blockchain-based monitoring and public reporting, ensuring that citizens could track the extraction and utilization of their natural wealth. Direct citizen participation. Revenue-sharing systems would provide direct payments to citizens rather than being filtered through potentially corrupt bureaucratic systems, using automated smart contracts to ensure fair distribution. Collaborative sovereignty. Nations would work together to prevent the kind of economic warfare that had been attempted against Burkina Faso, providing mutual support and alternative trading relationships to reduce vulnerability to external pressure. Technological innovation. Shared development of government's technologies would accelerate implementation while reducing costs, creating a global network of transparent, accountable resource management systems. By the second anniversary of the French asset freeze, the economic results of the SEO model were undeniable. Burkina Faso's GDP had grown by 12% annually, driven by fair value resource sales and efficient public investment. School enrollment had increased by 35% as education funding became transparent and guaranteed. Healthcare outcomes improved dramatically as medicine supplies became regular and predictable. But the numbers told only part of the story. Public satisfaction surveys showed unprecedented levels of trust in government, with over 80% of citizens expressing confidence that their leaders were acting in the national interest. Corruption perceptions indices ranked all 3 SEO nations among the most improved globally. Most significantly, brain drain, the chronic migration of educated Africans to Europe and North America, had begun reversing. Young professionals were returning home to participate in building transparent, prosperous societies where their talents could contribute to national development rather than foreign enrichment. The success of the SEO model catalyzed changes far beyond the original 3 nations. Nigeria implemented blockchain tracking for its oil revenues, leading to the recovery of billions in previously diverted funds. Ghana's cocoa farmers began receiving fair market prices for their crops through transparent trading platforms. The Democratic Republic of Congo established citizen oversight of cobalt mining, ensuring that local communities benefited from global demand for electric vehicle batteries. The African Union, initially cautious about endorsing the sovereignty movement, eventually established the Continental Resource Governance Initiative, providing technical assistance to member nations seeking to implement transparent resource management systems. The African Development Bank created new financing mechanisms specifically designed to support sovereignty-oriented development projects. The success of Burkina Faso's People's Ledger had profound implications for the global technology industry. Silicon Valley companies that had long promised to democratize information and empower individuals found themselves studying practical implementations of their theoretical goals from one of the world's poorest countries. The technical achievements were remarkable by any standard. The distributed blockchain system processed over 100,000 transactions daily while maintaining complete transparency and near-perfect uptime. The mobile interfaces worked effectively even with limited internet connectivity, using innovative offline synchronization protocols. The citizen engagement platforms achieved participation rates that exceeded those of most established democracies. But the most important lesson was philosophical rather than technical. Traoré and his team had demonstrated that technology's greatest value lay not in creating new forms of entertainment or consumption, but in enabling genuine democratic participation and economic transparency.
Major technology companies began incorporating lessons from the Burkina Faso model into their own operations. Microsoft implemented public blockchain tracking for its supply chain management, allowing customers to verify the ethical sourcing of components in their devices. Google introduced transparent algorithmic governance for some of its decision-making processes, providing public insight into how certain automated systems functioned. The changes weren't merely cosmetic. Public transparency, initially adopted reluctantly by some companies to match the Burkina Faso model, often led to improved internal efficiency and decision-making. When corporate behavior became visible to stakeholders, both performance and ethics improved measurably. Venture capital firms began specifically seeking investment opportunities in transparency-focused technologies. The Burkina Standard became shorthand for governance platforms that prioritized citizen empowerment over institutional control. Universities across the world restructured their curricula to incorporate lessons from the CO model. Harvard Business School made the Burkina Faso case study mandatory for all MBA students. MIT's computer science program added courses on blockchain applications for governance. The Stanford Graduate School of Business created an entire concentration area around technology for democratic development. But perhaps more significantly, African universities found themselves at the center of global academic networks for the first time. The University of Ouagadougou's computer science program began attracting international students seeking to understand practical applications of blockchain technology. Faculty exchanges brought American and European professors to Burkina Faso to learn from the architects of the People's Ledger. The transformation of the Sahel governance had severe consequences for French commercial interests. Mining companies that had operated for decades under favorable agreements found themselves subject to fair market pricing and transparent oversight. Banks that had dominated regional financial services were replaced by local institutions operating on democratic principles. Total SA, the French oil giant, lost several major concessions in Niger when transparent bidding processes favored competitors offering better terms. Areva, later Orano, the nuclear fuel company, faced renegotiated uranium contracts that provided fair compensation to Niger's government and people. French banks saw their West African market share plummet as digital financial services eliminated the need for traditional correspondent banking relationships. The economic impact extended beyond individual companies to France's overall economic model. For decades, favorable access to African resources had subsidized French industrial competitiveness and maintained artificially low energy costs. The new transparency and fair pricing requirements forced French companies to compete on equal terms with global competitors for the first time. French political leaders struggled to develop coherent responses to the sovereignty movement. Traditional diplomatic pressure proved ineffective against governments with strong popular support and alternative economic partnerships. Military intervention was politically impossible, given international scrutiny and African unity. Covert operations were repeatedly exposed by the same transparency systems they were attempting to subvert. The French public, learning through leaked documents about decades of neo-colonial manipulation, began questioning their country's African policy. Polls showed majority support for respectful partnership relationships rather than continued attempts at dominance. Young French citizens in particular expressed embarrassment about their country's continued colonial attitudes. Opposition parties began calling for complete reformation of France's Africa policy, advocating for genuine partnership based on mutual benefit rather than historical privilege. The debate revealed fundamental divisions within French society about their country's role in the post-colonial world. Eventually, French leadership recognized that the old model was permanently obsolete. President Macron announced a new partnership framework with African nations, emphasizing respect for sovereignty and transparent economic relationships. French companies began adapting their business models to operate within democratic oversight systems. The transformation was painful but ultimately beneficial. French firms that successfully adapted to transparent operations often found that ethical practices improved their efficiency and competitiveness. Companies that embraced fair pricing discovered stable, long-term partnerships rather than the constant political uncertainty of the old extraction model. Most importantly, France began developing genuine expertise in supporting democratic governance and transparent economic systems, positioning French institutions as valuable partners in global development rather than neo-colonial controllers. 3 years after the financial freeze that had threatened to destroy his government, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York. But he was no longer there as the leader of a small, embattled African nation seeking assistance or recognition. He was there as the architect of a governance model that was being studied and adopted worldwide. His speech to the General Assembly was titled, "From Extraction to Empowerment: Building Economies that Serve People Rather than Power." The address laid out a comprehensive vision for global economic transformation based on the principles that had emerged from Burkina Faso's crisis. 3 years ago, Traoré began, a major power attempted to strangle our nation through financial warfare, believing that controlling our bank accounts meant controlling our destiny. They forgot that our wealth lies not in foreign banks, but in our land, our people, and our determination to be free. He continued, "What we have built is not just an alternative to neo-colonial exploitation. It is a demonstration that democracy and transparency are not luxuries for rich countries, but necessities for any nation that wants sustainable development and genuine prosperity." The impact of Traoré's model extended far beyond resource-rich developing countries. Cities across the United States began implementing blockchain-based budget transparency systems, allowing residents to track how their tax dollars were spent. Canadian provinces adopted citizen dividend models for natural resource revenues. European nations created public dashboards for tracking the effectiveness of foreign aid and development spending. The Burkina Standard became shorthand for governance systems that prioritized transparency, citizen participation, and accountable resource management. International organizations began incorporating these principles into their assessment criteria for aid, investment, and partnership decisions. The success of the SEO model fundamentally challenged development economics orthodoxy. For decades, academic theory had emphasized the importance of international integration, foreign investment, and gradual institution building supported by external expertise. The Burkina Faso example demonstrated that rapid, citizen-centered transformation was possible when leadership prioritized sovereignty over compliance. Major economics journals published special issues examining the theoretical implications of the SEO model. The Journal of Development Economics ran a comprehensive analysis showing that transparency-based governance systems consistently outperformed traditional aid-dependent models across multiple metrics. The American Economic Review published papers demonstrating how blockchain-based resource tracking eliminated systematic corruption while improving economic efficiency. Nobel Prize-winning economists began incorporating the Burkina Faso case into their theoretical frameworks. Joseph Stiglitz wrote extensively about how the SEO model demonstrated the superiority of transparency-based development over traditional structural adjustment programs. Paul Krugman analyzed the alliance's trade relationships as examples of how developing nations could escape dependency cycles through strategic cooperation. The technological innovations pioneered in Burkina Faso began influencing systems worldwide. The distributed ledger architecture, developed for resource tracking, became the foundation for supply chain transparency in industries ranging from pharmaceuticals to electronics. The citizen engagement platforms influenced the design of digital democracy initiatives across multiple continents. Major technology companies began recruiting African engineers who had worked on the People's Ledger system, recognizing their unique expertise in building robust, transparent systems under challenging conditions. Several Silicon Valley startups were founded specifically to commercialize governance technologies developed in the Sahel region. The World Economic Forum established the Center for Democratic Technology Innovation, headquartered jointly in Davos and Ouagadougou, bringing together technologists, governance experts, and policymakers to advance transparent systems globally. Perhaps the most profound impact of Traoré's revolution was on Africa's youth. For the first time in generations, young Africans could see a clear path from education to meaningful participation in their country's development. Universities across the continent reported surges in enrollment in computer science, economics, and public policy programs as students sought to replicate the Burkina Faso model in their own nations. The Traoré generation, young Africans who came of age during the sovereignty movement, displayed markedly different attitudes from their predecessors. Instead of viewing emigration to Europe or North America as the path to success, they increasingly saw nation-building as the most meaningful career option. Youth organizations across Africa organized transparency marches, demanding that their governments adopt blockchain-based accountability systems. Student groups created their own distributed ledgers to track university budget allocations and academic performance. Young entrepreneurs developed applications that allowed citizens to monitor everything from municipal water projects to national road construction. The success of the SEO model created a new template for African leadership. Political movements across the continent began emphasizing transparency, technical competence, and citizen engagement over traditional appeals to ethnic loyalty or ideological rhetoric. In Kenya, a 35-year-old software engineer named Grace Wanjiku won a gubernatorial election running on a platform of implementing county-level resource tracking systems. In Ghana, computer scientist Dr. Kwame Oze became Minister of Mines after developing blockchain protocols for cocoa supply chain management. Nigeria's Kano state elected a former blockchain developer as governor based on his promises to create transparent budget systems. These new generation of leaders shared common characteristics: technical education, international experience, and absolute commitment to transparent governance. They viewed corruption not merely as a moral failing, but as a technical problem that could be solved through better systems design. The sovereignty movement catalyzed broader cultural changes across Africa. Traditional concepts of leadership based on patronage and personal relationships evolved toward performance-based evaluation and institutional accountability. Citizens increasingly viewed access to information about government activities as a fundamental right rather than a privilege granted by benevolent leaders. Art and music reflected these changes. Hip-hop artists across Francophone Africa recorded songs celebrating economic independence and citizen empowerment. Visual artists created installations featuring blockchain visualizations and data flows. Literature explored themes of technological sovereignty and democratic participation. The movement also influenced gender dynamics. Women's participation in technology and governance increased dramatically as transparent systems reduced the importance of traditional male-dominated networks. Female entrepreneurs found new opportunities in the growing digital governance sector. Women's rights organizations used transparency tools to monitor gender-inclusive development programs. 5 years after the French asset freeze, the economic transformation of the SEO nations was undeniable. Independent audits by international organizations confirmed remarkable improvements across multiple indicators. Economic growth. Average annual GDP growth across the 3 nations exceeded 9%, driven by fair value resource sales and efficient public investment. Unlike previous African growth spurts based on commodity booms or foreign investment, this growth was sustainable and broadly distributed. Poverty reduction. Extreme poverty rates fell by over 60% as direct citizen dividends provided guaranteed basic income floors. The transparency distribution system eliminated the bureaucratic inefficiencies that had historically prevented anti-poverty programs from reaching their intended beneficiaries. Infrastructure development. Road, school, and hospital construction accelerated dramatically as transparent bidding processes eliminated inflated costs and corrupt practices. Citizens could track infrastructure projects from planning through completion, ensuring quality standards and timely delivery. Educational advancement. School enrollment reached near universal levels as education funding became predictable and transparent. More importantly, curriculum reforms emphasized science, technology, and civic participation, preparing students for active roles in democratic governance. Healthcare improvements. Transparent pharmaceutical procurement systems ensured reliable medicine supplies while eliminating price gouging. Citizen oversight of health facility construction and staffing led to dramatic improvements in rural healthcare access. The SEO model's success attracted new forms of international investment. Sovereign wealth funds and pension managers seeking stable returns backed by verifiable assets began partnering with the alliance nations on infrastructure and development projects. Unlike traditional foreign investment focused on resource extraction, these partnerships emphasized mutual benefit and transparent governance. Impact investors found the blockchain-based accountability systems ideal for tracking social and environmental outcomes. Development finance institutions redesigned their programs around the transparency principles pioneered in the Sahel. Even commercial banks began offering new financial products designed specifically for transparent government systems. The investment flows weren't just about money. They represented recognition that the SEO model offered superior risk management through verified asset backing and democratic oversight. International partners knew exactly what they were investing in and could track results in real time. The alliance's resource-backed trading system began attracting participants far beyond the original 3 nations. Ghana joined the gold-backed trade network, followed by Mali's neighbors in the Mano River Union. East African countries expressed interest in developing similar systems for their agricultural and mineral exports. The trading relationships bypassed traditional colonial-era patterns. Instead of shipping raw materials to Europe for processing and re-import as finished goods, the alliance nations began developing regional value-added manufacturing. Gold was processed into jewelry and electronics within the region. Agricultural products were manufactured into food products for local and regional consumption. Most significantly, the alliance's trading partners began adopting transparency standards to qualify for preferred trading status. Brazilian mining companies implemented blockchain tracking to access SEO markets. Indian pharmaceutical manufacturers adopted citizen oversight systems to qualify for alliance health contracts. The transparency standards were becoming global competitive advantages. 7 years after the original crisis, representatives from 38 African nations gathered in Lagos, Nigeria, for the Continental Economic Sovereignty Conference. The meeting culminated in the Lagos Declaration, a comprehensive framework for extending the SEO model across the entire continent. The declaration established the African Resource Governance Federation, ARGF, a continental organization dedicated to implementing transparent, citizen-centered resource management systems. Unlike traditional African organizations that functioned primarily as diplomatic forums, the ARGF was designed as an operational alliance with enforcement mechanisms and mutual support systems. Key provisions of the Lagos Declaration included continental resource tracking. A unified blockchain system would monitor resource extraction, processing, and trade across participating nations, creating unprecedented transparency in Africa's economic activities. Mutual defense protocols. Economic warfare against any member nation would trigger collective responses, including trade redirections and financial support systems that made external pressure ineffective. Technology sharing agreements. All member nations would have access to governance technologies developed within the Federation, accelerating implementation while reducing costs. Citizen dividend standards. Common frameworks for direct resource revenue sharing would ensure that natural wealth benefited ordinary citizens rather than political elites. Democratic oversight requirements. All major economic decisions within member nations would be subject to citizen review and input through standardized digital platforms. Rolling out the SEO model across 38 nations with different political systems, economic structures, and technological capabilities required unprecedented coordination and innovation. The ARGF established regional implementation centers in Accra, Nairobi, Cairo, and Johannesburg, staffed by experienced teams from the original SEO nations. The technical challenges were immense. Creating interoperable blockchain systems across nations with varying internet infrastructure required innovative solutions. Developing citizen engagement platforms that worked in dozens of languages and cultural contexts demanded extensive customization. Training thousands of government officials, civil society leaders, and citizens in new governance technologies required massive educational initiatives. But the political challenges were even greater. Existing political elites in many nations resisted transparency systems that would expose corruption and limit their traditional privileges. International corporations with favorable existing arrangements lobbied against changes that would require fair pricing and democratic oversight. Some external powers attempted to prevent the Federation's expansion through diplomatic pressure and economic incentives. Despite the challenges, implementation successes began accumulating across the continent. Tanzania's gold and gemstone sectors adopted blockchain tracking, leading to a 300% increase in documented production and proportional increases in government revenue. Kenya's coffee cooperatives implemented transparent pricing systems that doubled farmer incomes while improving product quality. Botswana's diamond industry became a model for equitable revenue sharing between government, communities, and individual citizens. The success stories created momentum for further expansion. Nations initially skeptical of the federation model began requesting technical assistance and observer status. International organizations began preferentially supporting African countries that had adopted transparency standards. Global commodity buyers increasingly favored suppliers with verified ethical and transparent operations.
The annual World Economic Forum in Davos had long been the symbol of global elite consensus on economic policy. The gathering typically featured discussions between heads of multinational corporations, finance ministers from major economies, and representatives of international organizations, all operating within established frameworks of global capital flows and institutional relationships. The 2030 Forum was different. For the first time, the African Resource Governance Federation was invited not as a peripheral participant seeking investment or assistance, but as a core presenter of economic models that were being studied and adopted worldwide. Ibrahim Traoré, now serving as the Federation's first Secretary General, delivered the forum's keynote address. His presentation, titled From Extraction to Empowerment, Building Economies for the 21st Century, challenged fundamental assumptions about development, governance, and international economic relationships. Instead of seeking integration into existing systems, the ARGF had created alternative systems that were proving more effective, more sustainable, and more legitimate than traditional models. The response from the Davos audience was telling. Rather than the polite attention typically given to African speakers, Traoré's presentation generated intense engagement. CEOs asked detailed questions about implementing transparency systems in their own operations. Finance ministers sought advice on citizen engagement platforms. International organization leaders requested partnerships to adapt ARGF innovations for global application. Universities across the world scrambled to understand and teach the implications of the African sovereignty movement. Harvard Business School's most popular course became the Burkina Faso model: Technology, Transparency, and Economic Development. MIT's computer science program added requirements in blockchain governance applications. The London School of Economics established an African Governance Innovation Institute as its fastest-growing research center. But the most significant academic development was the reversal of knowledge flows. For the first time since colonization, African universities became centers of innovation that attracted international students and faculty. The University of Ouagadougou's digital governance program became one of the world's most competitive graduate schools. Makerere University in Uganda developed cutting-edge research on mobile democracy platforms. The University of Cape Town's Transparency Technology Center attracted researchers from Silicon Valley and European tech hubs. African academics who had historically sought positions at Western universities began returning home to participate in the continent's intellectual renaissance. The brain drain that had weakened African institutions for decades began reversing as scholars recognized that the most innovative and impactful research was happening on the continent itself. Multinational corporations found themselves adapting to new realities created by the African sovereignty movement. Transparency requirements, initially seen as burdensome obstacles to traditional business practices, began generating competitive advantages for companies that embraced them effectively. Microsoft's adoption of supply chain blockchain tracking, initially implemented to meet ARGF trading requirements, improved efficiency and reduced costs across all global operations. The company's African operations became testing grounds for governance technologies that were later deployed worldwide.
Similarly, pharmaceutical companies that developed transparent pricing for ARGF markets found that clarity and predictability actually improved their profit margins while enhancing their reputations. The changes weren't limited to companies doing business in Africa. The Burkina standard of transparency and citizen engagement became markers of corporate responsibility that influenced consumer choices, investor decisions, and employee recruitment across global markets. Companies began competing not just on traditional metrics of price and quality, but on transparency and democratic accountability. The global financial system adapted to accommodate the new African economic models, often reluctantly but increasingly enthusiastically as benefits became clear. The International Monetary Fund, initially skeptical of resource-backed currencies and citizen dividend systems, began studying ARGF practices for possible incorporation into their own programs. Major banks developed new products specifically designed for transparent governance systems. Blockchain-verified asset backing became a standard feature of international development finance. Impact investing funds, specializing in democratic governance projects, became some of the fastest-growing segments of global capital markets. The changes represented more than technical adaptations. They reflected fundamental shifts in how international finance understood risk, accountability, and sustainable returns. Traditional opacity-based systems increasingly appeared antiquated and risky compared to transparent alternatives that provided real-time verification of performance and outcomes. A decade after that Monday morning when France froze Burkina Faso's assets, the world had transformed in ways that would have been impossible to imagine at the height of the crisis. What began as a desperate response to economic warfare had evolved into a global movement for transparent governance and democratic accountability. The statistics were remarkable, but told only part of the story. The ARGF now included 43 African nations, with combined GDP growth averaging 8% annually over the decade. Extreme poverty had been virtually eliminated across member countries through transparent resource revenue sharing. Educational enrollment and healthcare access had reached universal levels. Democratic participation, as measured by citizen engagement in governance processes, exceeded levels found in most established democracies. But the numbers alone couldn't capture the transformation in hope and dignity that had occurred across the continent. African youth increasingly saw their futures in building stronger societies at home rather than emigrating to Europe or North America. African leaders were consulted as experts on governance innovation rather than recipients of external advice. African institutions were studied and emulated rather than reformed according to external models. The influence of the African sovereignty movement extended far beyond the continent itself. Cities across the United States had adopted citizen budget transparency systems based on ARGF models. Canadian provinces used blockchain-based resource revenue tracking for their natural resource sector. European nations implemented citizen engagement platforms for major policy decisions. The European Union, initially resistant to African economic independence, had developed new partnership frameworks based on equality and mutual benefit rather than historical privileges. France, once the symbol of neo-colonial control, had become one of the most enthusiastic supporters of transparent partnership relationships. Most significantly, the entire framework of international development had evolved. Aid relationships based on donor-recipient hierarchies were replaced by partnerships focused on technological transfer and capacity building. International organizations redesigned their programs around transparency, accountability, and citizen empowerment, rather than institutional strengthening and policy compliance. The success of the African sovereignty movement challenged fundamental assumptions about development, democracy, and international relations that had dominated global thinking for decades. The idea that poor countries needed extensive external assistance and gradual institutional development was replaced by recognition that rapid transformation was possible when leadership prioritized citizen empowerment over external approval. The movement demonstrated that technology could be a tool for democratization rather than elite control, that transparency could be a source of efficiency rather than a constraint on effectiveness, and that sovereignty could be a foundation for international cooperation rather than an obstacle to global integration. Perhaps most importantly, the African example showed that alternatives to established systems were not just theoretically possible, but practically superior. The binary choice between integration into global systems or isolation from them had been replaced by the creation of new systems that achieved the benefits of integration while maintaining autonomy and accountability. As Ibrahim Traoré reflected on the decade since the crisis that had changed everything, he recognized that the revolution was far from complete. The success of the African model had inspired similar movements in Latin America, Asia, and even within developed countries, but significant challenges remained. Climate change required new forms of international cooperation that could build on the transparency and accountability principles pioneered in Africa, but address challenges that transcended national boundaries. Global inequality continued to fuel migration and conflict despite the success of sovereignty-based development models. Technological advancement accelerated the need for governance innovations that could keep pace with rapid change. But the foundation had been established. The idea that ordinary citizens could and should have real-time access to information about their government's activities was no longer radical. It was becoming a basic expectation of legitimate governance. The principle that natural resource wealth should benefit the people living above those resources rather than distant shareholders had evolved from aspiration to operational reality across dozens of countries. Most importantly, the confidence that poor countries could lead global innovation rather than merely adapting external models had been proven through sustained success over a decade of implementation. In a modest conference room in Ouagadougou on a Monday morning when his nation's financial lifeline had been severed by a distant power, Ibrahim Traoré had asked a simple question: who owns our gold mines? That question, emerging from desperation, had triggered the most profound transformation in post-colonial African history. The question challenged more than just economic relationships, it challenged the entire framework of dependency that had defined relations between Africa and the global economy for centuries. Instead of accepting that his nation's choices were limited to compliance or isolation, Traoré had asked whether different choices were possible. The answer, developed over months of intense innovation and years of sustained implementation, was a resounding yes. Not only were different choices possible, they were superior to the systems they replaced. Transparency proved more effective than opacity. Democratic accountability generated better outcomes than technocratic expertise. Citizen empowerment created more sustainable development than elite-driven programs. The Burkina Faso revolution offered lessons that transcended Africa and development economics. In an era of declining trust in institutions worldwide, the African sovereignty movement demonstrated that legitimacy could be rebuilt through transparency and citizen participation. At a time when technology was often seen as a threat to democracy, the ARGF model showed how digital tools could enhance rather than undermine democratic governance. Most fundamentally, the African example proved that systemic change was possible even under the most challenging circumstances. A landlocked nation in one of the world's poorest regions, facing economic warfare from a global power, had not only survived but thrived by building something better than what existed before. The revolution's success inspired similar movements worldwide, but also provided practical blueprints for transformation. The technical systems, governance frameworks, and implementation strategies developed in Africa were being adapted and applied across continents, creating a global network of transparent, accountable, citizen-centered governance systems. As the world continues to grapple with challenges ranging from climate change to technological disruption to persistent inequality, the African sovereignty movement offers both inspiration and practical guidance. The principles pioneered in Burkina Faso, transparency, accountability, citizen empowerment, and technological innovation, provide foundations for addressing global challenges while maintaining democratic legitimacy and local autonomy. The story that began with a financial freeze intended to force submission had evolved into a global movement for democratic transformation. The question that Ibrahim Traoré asked in desperation, "Who owns our gold mines?" had become a template for people everywhere asking who controls the systems that shape their lives and whether those systems serve their interests. The revolution sparked in 48 minutes had proven that profound change was possible when leadership combined moral clarity with technical competence and genuine commitment to citizen empowerment. It demonstrated that the future belongs to those who control existing systems, but to those who build better alternatives. And the story continues to unfold, as new generations of leaders worldwide ask the same fundamental question that started it all. Who really owns the wealth that should serve the people? And what are we willing to do to ensure it actually does? In conference rooms and classrooms, in workshops and parliaments, in laboratories and communities across the globe, people are still asking Traoré's question and discovering that the answer can change everything. The gold gambit that began as financial warfare had become a blueprint for human empowerment. The revolution continues.